Okay, good.
All right, well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Kale Zelden podcast. I'm here again with my good friend, Dr. Larry Chapp. And Larry, it's been quite a few days here since we were recording a show for my other podcast, the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. We were hit with I guess what we would call in sort of American terms, a Friday news dump from the Vatican this past Friday with a Motu, and so I was wondering if you, I see, of course, too, that you had a nice response on your blog, Gaudium at spes22.com, but I just wanted to get you on and let's just talk a little bit about what your sense of things, what's your sense of things and how things are unfolding and where your thoughts are now. So welcome.
Well, thanks for inviting me. And there's just so many thoughts swirling around, and of course it has just set off a firestorm in social media circles over the Pope's Inapproprio. And I think the firestorm, at least in my own concern too, is that the problem with Traditionalists Custodes, isn't that ironic?
I wanted to make some bad jokes about that.
I mean, the guardian of tradition. All right. And essentially he's holding up a 50 or 60-year-old liturgy that was invented out of whole cloth, essentially. And mind you, I'm not an anti-Novus Ordo guy at all. It has its problems, but I'm not an anti-Novus. But still, I mean, this is a brand new liturgy. And he's quashing the liturgy of the ages, essentially, and then calling this guarding tradition. Nothing.
Yeah, no, it's rich. I mean, it's rich and fraught with this kind of double speak that, look, I've just, I've been around the block too many times to sort of just sit and listen to this kind of stuff with a straight face, right?
I know. And I think one of the suspicions that people have and why it's not just with regard to its legal stipulations, there's a deep foreboding sense that Traditiones says more than it says.
Right, it's loaded, right? Exactly. There's this sort of the stuff on the surface of, and I noticed, not to get too technical about this, but there was an accompanying letter which seemed to be quite revelatory about the subtext.
Yeah, and I think, God, once again, my thoughts are such a jumble, but I'll start with that it says more than it says, because there's that lingering question as to, was this, as my friend Christopher Altieri at the Catholic Herald says, is this like cutting off your whole hand because you have a hangnail? I mean, was the problem that big that it required this draconian coming and a real slap in the face to Benedict XVI and Summorum Pontificarum? No, the problem wasn't that big. And meanwhile, you've got the Germans spinning off into their own schismatic fantasy land. And here,
like actual schismatic fairyland.
Germans also protested the CDF document on same-sex blessings, and by blessing all kinds of same-sex unions with no repercussions of any kind. There are these gay pride masses all over the United States all the time now, and nobody's going to knock those down. Or there's been all of this dissent from the left for many years, but all of a sudden now we're supposed to be deeply concerned. What this says to me is that there's a subtext here to me. I don't think Pope Francis likes the United States very much.
No, that's pretty clear. I think that's fair.
Part of his
Larry.
South American makeup. Okay, sometimes there's good reasons why South Americans may have negative appraisals of the United States.
Sure. Yeah, you and I are adults. We're capable of understanding that much,
of the universal church. And yet it seems as if he's made no effort to truly understand the American church. And I think now we are beginning to see the true fallout of what I wrote about months ago of the elevation to Vatican posts of Cardinals Cupich, Tobin, Farrell, and so on. I think he's getting advice on what is going on in the American church from people like Cupich and Tobin. And the advice they're giving him is that the TLM movement is just a hotbed of anti-Francis, anti-Vatican II. All those voices are there, but that's not what characterizes the movement as a whole, as I noted.
Well, notice Yeah, notice, of course, I always pay attention to who people in power punch down on. And I find it very fascinating that they're electing to punch down on the TLM crowd, which by all, measurements is a pretty small deal. Right. And so, both you and I are coming at this. And I think the anger that you and I have about the situation is, on one hand, just anger on behalf of my actual brothers, but my brothers and sisters in Christ who have found something meaningful in the Latin Mass. Right. So that's number one. But I'm struck by the sort of the meanness of this whole thing. For someone who talks about the synodal way and reaching out to the margins, this is an incredibly high-handed method of governance.
It truly is. I mean, one of the hallmarks of his papacy, right, is this constant refrain of accompaniment, dialogue,
right,
reaching out to the margins. Well, these people are on the margins. Like you said, he's punching down to people that are on the margins. He wants to smell like the sheep, but apparently not these sheep. Okay, he'd rather smell like the sheep in Germany than these sheep in the United States. So there's a coldness to it, a legalism to it, a harshness to it that completely destroys the whole notion of accompaniment and dialogue that he talks about so much. It is just unfathomable to me that this document came out with such cold, harsh.
So you're a veteran sort of watcher of the scene. You're a theologian. How much do you think his recent extended hospitalization has sort of played a part in this pretty swift and high-handed move? Am I just sort of grasping at straws here?
Well, in a rare disagreement, I'm going to say yes. Because
okay. No, that's fine. That's fine.
The information that we have from people who are inside, the Vatican and write about it is that this document has been in preparation for a very, very long time. And there were rumors even before he went into the hospital that it was going to be promulgated even on the feast day of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Of course, there's also this speculation that, the document's been long being prepared, but they were kind of waiting until Pope Benedict passed on to his reward. But Pope Benedict has done the greatly inconvenient thing, like a giant tortoise. He's lived on and on and on, for into his 90s now. And I think there's they finally just said, look, we can't wait any longer. Now, I don't know if they were waiting for that reason, but.
Did you catch the piece by Father Thomas Reese? I think it was in America magazine, where it was Benedict, the Holy Father, Pope Francis had just returned from the extended stay after the surgery, and he basically just said this has been a failed project regarding Francis's papacy, and then literally 48 hours later, we had this. So that's really why I'm asking. Again, I'm not a veteran, or I have no inside knowledge. I'm just sort of a layperson out here toiling in the wilderness, trying to raise my family and be a faithful son of Christ.
You might be onto something here, as I'm cogitating and listening to you, in the sense that the document was prepared and the rumors were it was going to come out on Friday, and it did. Nevertheless, the Pope is the one who makes the final decision, and he may have been really going back and forth in his mind. Do I do this? Do I not do this? Is this the right thing, the wrong thing? But after his hospital stay, maybe he said to himself, life is short. I may not have that much longer in the papacy. Maybe I need to get on with this, and send it out there. So I don't know. That's speculation. But Tom Reese, that piece that he wrote, was very, very interesting because his claim is that several claims. One is that all of the new young seminarians and young priests are essentially devotees of John Paul and Benedict, or even more traditionalist.
Even more traditional,
and none of them are devotees of Pope Francis.
Well, he even said that trying to find a young priest sort of in the Francis mold is like searching for a unicorn. I believe he used that phrase.
Any young priest, he said, in the Francis mold, willing to take on the life of celibacy is going to be as rare as a Catholic unicorn. And I think he's right. And it's not just about the Francis papacy. The fact is that liberal Catholicism for decades now has not generated vocations to the priesthood. That's why there is a vocations crisis. You go to very traditional dioceses and very traditional religious orders, and they have plenty of vocations. It's the uber, either the liberal or the banal dioceses that just don't have any vocation. So Reese is right, but he's right, I think, for the wrong reasons. But
right. I think that's fair.
Say it's a failed papacy because Francis isn't going to live long enough to outlive the episcopacy that had been put in place by John Paul and Benedict. I'm not certain that's true. Francis has appointed a lot of bishops, and more importantly, he's appointed a lot of cardinals, and they might decide at his passing to elect another Jorge Bergoglio type. No.
Well, and let's remember that it's not like he inherited what you and I might consider a healthy and vibrant episcopacy, or presbyterate, or just yesterday there was a story came out from the Pillar Catholic about the director or the chief secretary of the USCCB. And this scandal about Monsignor Burrell, and this scandal about gay sex app and a double lifestyle, in other words. So my point is not to merely to sort of bring that story up in a salacious way, but rather the rot that you and I have talked about on other shows. To be fair, the rot is so deep. I'm not sure even if Pope Francis died today or died 5 years ago that it really would have been any different. And maybe that's just my own sort of dark, dim view of things.
I think you're onto something here. Just as the sort of radical traditionalists have a certain romanticized vision of the pre-Vatican II church, I think a lot of now more conservative Catholics who were fans of John Paul and Benedict have a romanticized vision of what Catholicism was like, merely 20 years ago or 25 years ago.
Right.
I mean, as someone, I'm age 62, almost 63, as someone who lived through the post-Vatican II silly season and then went to, Fordham, got my doctorate, and then entered into the professorate. One of the things I said to my colleagues, because I had so many colleagues saying, it's the new JP2 generation coming up.
Right.
It's going to transform the church. And I was saying, no. The young, devoted Catholics who are in the mold of JP2 and Benedict who are becoming priests, they're a minority. The fact is the engines of Catholicism were still dominated by the progressive Tom Reese wing of the Catholic Church. It was just sitting there latently percolating away because they knew they weren't going to make much headway under the pontificate of John Paul and Benedict. All they were waiting for was this catalytic moment. I mean, there was still all kinds of liturgical abuses going on under those pontificates. There were still all kinds of theological dissent in the academy going on in those pontificates. There was still all kinds of banal, mediocre Catholicism in that era.
And let's remember, Larry, lest people accuse the two of us of being sort of golden age Catholics. Neither of us believe in sort of golden ageism, right? The reason why the church was such a mess in the 70s and 80s was because it was a mess in the 40s and 50s, right? So a very easy and sort of too simplified hermeneutic here, or heuristic, is to sort of think, oh, well, this is sort of a post-Vatican II problem. I mean, there's certainly lots of problems post-Vatican II, but I would say that institutionally, the rot far precedes any sort of business about the council. I mean, let's not forget that the great Cardinal Spellman, was the master of the double life that we know now. And he was, of course, this great advocate for robust, muscular Catholicism, and yet here he was living a total gay double life.
And let's not forget, shall we, that the darling child of John Paul II, the Legionaries of Christ,
Maciel
was being
right.
led by a beast, a monster who was leading not a double life, but like a triple life.
Yeah, quadruple life.
You know, and you know, I'm not saying John Paul knew and tried to cover it up. I'm saying he just maybe turned a blind eye. I mean, John Paul is a hero of mine, still is, but no popes are perfect, and I think he was really lacking in the discernment of what was going on with the sex abuse crisis. But anyway, that's a different topic for.
Yeah, it's a different topic. I mean, I'd like to keep it back to this sort of this Motu and you know what. I mean, how do you see this whole thing sort of unfolding? I mean, look, as I've been paying attention, you know, it is inescapable that the church is run as a monarchy. We know that, and you know, despite the fact that you and I live in the United States of America, and we might be more fond of a Republican form of government or something like that, the church is in fact a monarchy. And we, of course, live in the wake of Vatican II and Vatican I, which was in many respects really about the shoring up of that power. And we see here exercised, you know, you and I were fans of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, two people who had the sort of, at certain times, a reputation for being kind of heavy-handed and arch-conservative, and yet never governed that way at all. The ironic flip here is we have someone who talks about the synodal pathway, talks about accompaniment, talks about you know, ministering to the margins, and yet he's the one who's really exercising, flexing like a sort of a full-throated monarch.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in my blog, how ironic it is that the Pope, who's been talking about a decentralized papacy, is also now wanting Rome. You know, you have to get permission from Rome now if you're a priest and you want to speak the traditional Latin mass, re-centralize. And I want to point out, though, too, there's different kinds of monarchies. And the monarchy in the Catholic Church, ironically, is not as close to the sort of divine right of king's monarchy you saw in places like France and England and so forth. It's closer to a medieval monarchy, early Renaissance monarchy, where a king ruled, but he ruled through the mediation of the landed aristocracy. And he had to pay attention to the landed aristocracy because without them, he couldn't do much. And that's why it created such convulsions in Europe and war as kings consolidated monarchic divine right power at the expense of the landed aristocracy. That said, my analogy is this. The papacy is more like those medieval monarchies that ruled through various viceroys and mediations. And therefore, the way forward is going to be, unfortunately, the landed aristocrats, the bishops, are going to be at odds with one another. And so there are going to be bishops that say, I'm in line with Pope Francis and Traditionis Custodes and mean it, and really go after the traditionalists. And then there's going to be bishops that'll pay lip service to it, all the while trying to find ways around it. I think that's going to be our future here.
Right. Okay. But the incentive structure is lined up for those people who look to kiss butt to Rome.
Yes. Correct. Well, let me give you a story here from my own seminary. I was in seminary, both minor and major, 1978 to 1985. And so at the very beginning of the John Paul II papacy. But even then, in seminary formation, it was not unique to my seminary. This was the way it was. In my seminary formation, the one thing you never wanted to be called as a seminarian by the formators was rigid. That was the word, rigid. Correct. And rigid was a code for you're not lining up with the spirit of Vatican II as we define it. Even though you would not be doing, I knew a seminarian classmate of mine who read the breviary in Latin. A classmate of ours turned him in to the rector of the seminary and said, hey, so-and-so is reading in Latin. That seminarian was severely disciplined and told he could no longer do that. Even though Vatican II as such certainly didn't forbid that, the spirit of Vatican II did. And so there was a witch hunt out in those days for any seminarian that displayed any kind of hyper-traditionalist tendencies. Now, and that's what's going to happen with Traditionis.
Right. Okay. So, like, exactly. So what kind of, so you didn't make the cut. I'm not saying that you couldn't cut it, but you discerned out of the priesthood. Who survives through that kind of selection process? This is really interesting to me, right? In other words, the kind of person who can wade through these sort of shark-infested waters is what kind of person?
kinds of different kinds of people, mostly
Okay.
mostly dysfunctional. But that's, I often say to people, and once again off topic, but when I was in seminary, I met the greatest human beings I've ever known in my life and the scariest human beings I've ever known in my life.
Yeah.
And the fact is that winnowing process had a tendency to drive away the better ones and to keep the worst ones. And so you had gay seminarians that were flying under the radar, doing a sort of sub rosa life. And so they were attracted to the lifestyle. There were seminarians who just went along. Okay. So subservient, the obedient types. Sure. Okay. Whatever you tell me to do is what I'm going to do. And so I think a great majority of priests that came out of that system fall into that category of kind of very subservient and obedient to whatever the prevailing episcopal decisions are. And any priest that challenged that kind of got smacked down.
Yeah, that certainly lines up with the kind of stories that my friends, both who made it through and became priests, and my friends who discerned out like you, that it in a perverse sort of way, the system rewards a certain kind of political operator that can sort of live a double life, right? That can kind of salute and know the ways to go. Like, I mean, how do you get selected to go to NAC? I mean, how do you get selected to become a pre-bishop? I mean, how do you get selected to be a bishop? And these are all very important questions. And when when the guardians of the selection process, and this is a process that, of course, takes place for a very long time, right? The guardians of those selection processes can really do a number and are very powerful and influential in terms of who they can kind of bring up the chain.
Oh, I agree.
It seems to me that it's precisely those kind of hierarchy rats that learn to work the system to their maximal advantage, and those do not tend to be the kind of guys who are good shepherds. They tend to be the guys who are good at politics.
There's that, and I agree with that completely. Actually, I think that's good analysis. But as you're talking, I'm also realizing in the diocesan priesthood and diocesan seminaries, and I don't mean any slight here at all. I have so many friends who are still in the priesthood and I know bishops who are classmates of mine who are good bishops, but there is a certain intellectual mediocrity. And I'm not unveiling anything that would be earth-shattering here to any seminary formator in a diocesan priesthood.
Right.
And that kind of intellectual mediocrity, a lack of intellectual curiosity, a kind of another kind of priest that gets turned out is simply a very pietistical priest who doesn't think about anything. And so none of this ecclesiastical stuff bothers them in the slightest. They're going to still do their novenas to Saint Figida and blah blah blah, and they're fine. You know what? And they usually turn out to be pretty good priests, actually. Brick and mortar priests, we used to call them. And in some sense, the other thing I want to point out is I'm not certain modern seminaries for the past 10, 20 years are the same as when I was there, because the pendulum swang, and most seminarians. The problem is now completely opposite. So many seminarians are now listening to Taylor Marshall and in that sort of radical. So formators are like yanking their hair out, saying, okay, we get what they're about. They're young, they're intellectually immature, but so how do we move them forward into something else? And so my fear is that Traditiones Custodes is now going to be just like the spirit of Vatican II before. Not with all bishops and seminary formators, but with a significant number of them. They're going to put down all of these draconian measures in formation under the guise of living up to the new spirit of tradition. I could be wrong about that, but that is my gut fear. And this is a guy whose blog has routinely criticized some of the bigger internet provocateurs from the traditionalist movement,
Right. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a fascinating moment. I do think the two things are connected. The reason why I brought up the Monsignor Burrell story and this action by the Holy Father, I think it exposes a kind of, one of the things that I've noticed, and this seems to be across a multitude of institutions. Rod and I on my other podcast talk a lot about institutional rot and institutional capture, and it seems to be true in government. It seems to be true in higher ed and lower ed, for that matter. It seems to be true of academia. It seems to be true of journalism. That there is a deep disconnect between the elite population that sort of man and staff the institutions and the kind of on the ground reality. And one of the things that struck me in your piece, Larry, this piece about the abyss, the hermeneutics of the abyss, is that they don't seem to understand, for instance, why would a young seminarian hear, the sort of the work of Taylor Marshall, for instance, and why would they respond to that? Like, in other words, instead of saying, "Oh, Taylor Marshall, hate Taylor Marshall," I mean, fine, like we can play that game. I mean, I have my issues with his work for sure, but I think the more profound question is, why are these young people, well-intentioned, faith-filled men who are genuinely contemplating giving their life to the church, why are they moved by somebody like Taylor Marshall? Nobody wants to ask that question.
No. And that's kind of the central metaphor of my blog, where I talk about the hermeneutics of the abyss, which comes from a quote from Ratzinger. It has to do with the fact that I'm more troubled by what Traditiones doesn't say and doesn't do than what it actually does. What it doesn't do, as I say, is to lay out any kind of a pastoral awareness or pastoral analysis of how we got to this point in the first place. There seems to be no awareness at all on the part of this papal administration that people are out there dying, thirsting for some kind of spiritual nurture. As I said, we're asking for bread and we're being given stones. And this has been going on for 50 or 60 years in so many ways.
That's right.
And so if people have sort of reached out to these traditionalist movements because there they find a mooring, there they find a lifeboat, there they find something to grab onto, now is not the time to slap them down. Now is the time to ask yourself the question, as you just did, why are these young people in particular flocking to these movements? What is lacking in the church and what has been lacking? And what it is the church has had no awareness at all of the radical nature of our modern culture as an antithesis to Christianity.
And it's something else you're fond of pointing out, Larry, and I want to remind you of this, is that, there also seems to be zero awareness of the radicalness of the call. Right. That it's such a strange inversion that it's the young people in this case, these alternate folks who are selecting into these more robust, I guess we would say, sort of Catholic communities. They're longing. They are moved by the radical call to holiness, and they look at a suburban parish. You and I like to joke about the suburban parish, but it's true. They look at the suburban parish, they look at the beige Catholicism that Bishop Barron talks about, and they're like, what that's meaningless. It does nothing. It stands for nothing. Yeah. At least these guys are saying, look, man, pray the rosary, go to mass, fast hard, do these things that show that you actually believe in Jesus.
Yeah, what they're thirsting after in all of that is the supernatural and an experience of the supernatural that they believe a robust form of Catholicism gives them, but a suburban bourgeois beige form of Catholicism most certainly does not. And therein lies the problem, that accommodation, that appeasement that we have made to modernity, where the church has lost its, as I've said before, its eschatological edge, its forcefulness, its verve, to pardon the use of this word, its masculinity. And what
That's
we've
right.
seen is as an effeminization of the church, which, we talk about, women's ordination and stuff, and it's disaffecting women. The bigger problem the church has is the disaffection of men from the church, because the church is a relatively effeminate place that does not emphasize masculinity. And that is another feature of this traditional Catholicism that is so attractive to these young men who are entering the priesthood. It's masculine, and it's virile, and it's robust, and it's vigorous. And they want something to commit. And I can relate to, one of the reasons why I'm kind of hard on the Taylor Marshalls of the church is, when I was a young man, we need to remember how intellectually and emotionally immature people 18 to 25 actually
That's
are.
right.
We tend to forget.
Right.
Look at your own life and remember, what was I like then? When I was a young seminarian, if Taylor Marshall had been on the interwebs, I would have been watching.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way.
Absolutely, yes, because he's speaking towards something that is substantial, not abstract, right? I mean, I think that's the appeal. And again, you and I think we both are critical of what, in his work and others like him. His work is not because we find it completely distasteful, but it's because there's a kernel of truth in what he's doing, that in our experience of church seems to have been completely abandoned.
Yeah, and that's why he speaks to so many people. I mean, my issue with him isn't his desire to return to traditional values. It's that he has gradually evolved over the years, obviously, into a much more radical version of that. Somebody I know said that he has all the grifts of the Holy Spirit. I think he's evolved into a clickbait artist.
Well, indeed. I mean, look, we all have to be conscious of the way that the algorithms can make us. But right, so I mean, I guess the larger point is that it's interesting to me that this very sort of top-down, slap-down move vis-a-vis the Motu Proprio comes out, and then less than a week later we get this other story of yet another part of the seemingly endless unraveling of the church sex scandal. Now, this is not a sex abuse situation explicitly, right? I mean, they were very clear in that piece that it was...
Absolutely, that's why...
Well, that I want to draw that connection up because look, I mean, think about people in our audience, right? So you see the one story, and Francis seems to be like, wow, he really doesn't like the Latin Mass nor the Latin Mass people. Okay, data point. And then, oh, here we go again, another story of a Monsignor living a ridiculous double life, and all the usual suspects jump out and they do their thing, like Father James Martin, was decrying this because the Monsignor is a vulnerable person. Like, what are you talking about? He's like the most powerful priest in the country who's not a bishop, and you're calling him vulnerable because he's on Grindr? Like, that's crazy. It's crazy talk.
To reread the terms of his agreement with Grindr to realize that none of that was right.
Seriously, the markers.
Anyway, they are deeply connected. As in today's blog post from Rod Dreher, I mean, he makes that connection explicitly. He begins by talking about this recent sex scandal, and then he starts talking about my blog about the hermeneutics of the abyss. And he agrees that my point is that modern people have been undermined spiritually by the fact that everything that rooted our culture in the faith is gone. And modernity is characterized by a misremembering of the past and an amnesia and erasure.
And a dissolving. It's a dissolver of the past.
Spiritual abyss that Ratzinger points out that we all feel like we are falling into. And that's why so many people are reaching out for something solid like traditionalism. And so Rod is right. Yeah. This scandal, this recent one, is just opening up that abyss beneath us all over again. All the while, the people up on top are removing the lifeboats.
Yeah. And not affected by this at all. Like, life just goes on. Like 3 years ago, we had the McCarrick thing. Like, one big collective shrug by the uppity ups, right? The muckety mucks. Nothing. Zero. No, and then here we go again. It happens all over again. And then, this is like part of my anger and frustration as a layman. It's like, guys, like, what like, why do I even waste my time getting up in front of people and saying, certainly to my students, for instance, as I try to witness to something bigger than myself and witness toward the faith of and Christ's church and all, like, why am I even bothering if you're going to go about your business as if nothing matters, as you have talked about many times, this sort of this de facto atheism, I could say the default nihilism that characterizes so many of these players.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said in a blog post a long time ago, when you're talking about men who enabled through cover-up, but also then often through cooperation, the raping of children, you are not talking about men who have faith. You are not talking about Christians. You're talking about something else. And I don't care what they call themselves. A Monsignor who is the head of the bishop's secretary, who's on Grindr for gay hookups, that's not a man of faith. Yeah. That is not a Christian at all, in any level. And I don't care what he pretends to be. And the fact of the matter is, the church is riddled with people like this. Riddled with it. And when is it going to end? It's only going to end when leadership decides that we need a revolution of the soul in the church. Okay, we need a revolution. We need a grand purgatorial repentance and conversion to take place. I guess what you would call a renewal, okay? A revival, to use a Protestant term.
Well, it's interesting because I'm reading Carlos Erie's book right now, Reformations, and it's all about all of the various reformations that occur with Luther, and then all the various versions of that as it gets all played out. And like, look, there is always, this is sort of part of the built-in tensions of historical Christianity. And I guess I am frustrated today, Larry, because we keep being told that, this is the renewal and this is the Reformation, and we're waiting for the fruits of the council to finally sort of manifest themselves. And I'm tired of hearing the pablum that passes as cover for their double lives.
Oh, absolutely.
And look, we're sinners. We know. Look, we're all sinners. We all have quote unquote double lives. Part of the challenge for us is to lead a unified life, right? And I put myself right in front there. Like, I struggle to live a unified life too, right? But at least I'm struggling to do it, like out loud, just saying it out loud right now. Like, I'm struggling to do this. It doesn't seem to be something that our betters, our higher ups, actually seem to struggle with.
It doesn't seem to be the case. And once again, I don't want to engage in bishop bashing or whatever. I know too many good ones. But, you can find a good bishop here, a good bishop there when you know them personally. But as a collective whole, something happens to them, in the Episcopal bureaucracy, where everything gets filtered through this sort of pablum filter, so that nothing decisive ever gets done. And that's the key word here. We are in a moment of crisis, which requires a moment of great decision, a great choosing this way, not that way. And instead of that, we get endless, anodyne, committee-generated statements that mean nothing and that nobody reads. There's no leadership. There's no prophetic denunciation of anything, unless it's about abortion, which I'm glad that they're doing at least that. All right, because I hate abortion and I'm opposed to it. But still, there needs to be this. There just needs to be this revival in their souls. And to bring it back to our point here, is it not true, despite the fact that there are bad elements in the traditionalist movement, and we all know that, is it not true that the traditionalist movement represented one of these little pinpricks of revival? As President Bush used to call it, 1,000 points of light.
1,000 points of light. Yeah,
there's 1,000 points of light in the church, and this is one of them. Okay, it's not all gloom and doom. There are little sprouts coming up in various ecclesial movements, and this was one of them.
Yeah, and I guess the solace that I take, and I don't think I'm selling myself a sweet little lie here, but I do think that this motu proprio is a sort of a last. We'll see, of course. I'm not good at making predictions. I don't gamble, but I do see this as sort of maybe the last or one of the last gasp shots of a tired, modernist inflected church who has no children, who has borne no fruit, and that this is sort of the last shot. And maybe this is it. Maybe this is the end. And it's all about the long game, isn't it?
Yeah.
We know in the end it'll be okay. It'll be hell until then. And maybe that this is the last. The sort of a rear guard action, and that we just have to endure and persevere and keep the faith. It's hard right now, Larry. I have to be honest with you, as a 48-year-old Catholic layman, it's really hard.
It's hard for me too, as a 62-year-old Catholic layman, and I hate to keep bringing that. Well, back in my day, but as a 62-year-old man, as I say in my blog, what this latest Motu represents to me is, my God, it's deja vu all over again. It really is the last gasp of that aging generation of refugees from the 60s and 70s, whose vision of the council and its implementation is still that of the wingnuts of the church.
Yeah.
Who want to go back to sock puppets and clown masters and things like this. Not that Pope Francis wants those things. Don't get me wrong. In many ways, he's an enigma because he's very traditional in other things. But the point is, the deeper issue involved in this Motu and why it disheartens people, why it says more than it says, is that it is a resounding affirmation of a particular school of thought with regard to how to implement the Second Vatican Council. And it is a resounding repudiation of any desire to place the council in grand continuity with the tradition in ways where that would allow the tradition itself to correct certain aspects of the council, such as the liturgical reform. Like I said, I'm not against the Novus Ordo. On the other hand, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I go to an ordinariate liturgy because I find it more beautiful than the Novus Ordo liturgy. The Novus Ordo can be done beautifully, but there's no doubt about the fact that one of the things that these guys fear is that Summorum Pontificorum was going to work. Not that it didn't work, but that it was going to. And that you were going to
I think that's exactly right.
More and more priests doing Novus Ordo liturgies, but wanting to do them with altar rails and people kneeling on communion, ad orientem and chant and incense. And they don't want that. They don't want that.
Right. And I'll say this sort of last thing, the deep irony of this is that it's the Motu has been done sort of with an eye toward unity, right? Unity, darn it, right? And of course, the easiest way to make the liturgy unified around the world in the Latin Rite is to have it in Latin. Just a suggestion. That's one language. That would have been a radical kind of unity through that. So irony's about
out there. Yes, I'm a big fan of Mass in the vernacular, but I do get your point. And the fact is, if the Pope were interested in unity, true unity, the better way, instead of polling bishops and then maybe cherry picking what he heard from ones he wanted to hear, mind you, the Vatican has not made at all transparent moves to publicize those questionnaires.
They can't because it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and so we'd like to know. A lot of journalists are now asking, investigative journalists, well, where is this poll? What did these bishops actually say?
Well, did you see Cardinal Zen came out and said, that's interesting because I didn't seem to get that survey. I wonder why. I wonder what he or Sarah would have said in that survey.
So, by all means, poll the bishops. Make the results transparent, but then also, why not, instead of the next synod being a synod on synods,
which is also hilarious. You're running out of things. We're going to have a synod on synods.
Jabberwocky. The thing is, why not have the next synod be on the liturgy and actually have it be a real synod that then invites a real dialogue between all of these participants so that they can really bring their concerns and bring the various camps together for the beauty and the glory of the liturgy and the church. And the Pope could have begun a grand dialogue, a grand reaching out to the various leaders of like the FSSP and so on. Why are you guys into this and so on? But no, he did none of that. As I say in my blog, He doesn't understand the traditionalist movement. He has it caricatured as nothing but dissent because he didn't bother to know.
Right.
He didn't bother to find out.
Yeah, and I think that's telling. I mean, time will tell, of course, how this whole thing plays out. But I part of my anger, both you and I are, I can't officially call myself a traditionalist because I don't go to the Latin Mass. I go to a Novus Ordo parish. I live and work in a monastery. So, I don't say that I'm not, I just don't want to mislead, the audience here, but I have deep affection, for the Mass of the Ages. And I have a deep, sympathy for my friends, and my family who are sort of officially traditionalists, or however you want to call it. And this is just, it's awful. And so, so they're looking at me like, Kale, like, look, I'm trying to raise my kids. I'm trying to, raise them in the faith. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to observe Lent. I'm trying to observe feast days. I'm trying to make myself worthy, go to confession so that I'm worthy to receive the sacrament on the Sabbath. All of those things, right? That, we should be for. And it just sort of feels like the Pope is picking on me. Like, I'm not Taylor Marshall. Like, I'm not these guys, mouthing off on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Like, I'm just like a guy. I go to work. I try to raise my family, and the Pope calls me rigid, and he shuts down my Mass.
Yeah.
Like what's the justification for that?
Compare that, and I don't want to set up an adversarial situation here, but take a Bishop Barron, once again, who has come under great attack from traditionalists, and I have.
Yeah, and you and I are fans. I mean, you and I are fans of the good Bishop
and I
Barron.
think the traditionalists have been grossly unfair to him. And Bishop Barron has made note of that. Like, here's what they're saying about me. But nevertheless, despite that, Bishop Barron has supported the traditional Latin Mass. He has supported Summorum Pontificorum. When he was rector of the seminary at Mundelein, he made sure that his seminarians were exposed to the traditional Latin Mass, knew it, and so on. So he's never been an enemy of it. And so what would have been wrong with Pope Francis taking more of that kind of an approach? Where, okay, you're going to be critical of the people you need to be critical of, while at the same time acknowledging, people like you. And I know a lot of people, good friends, who go to the traditional Latin Mass, and they're good people, raising fantastic families.
And remember, the Latin Mass type, when you were a young man, Larry, is a much different type. Sorry, I keep using the same word, than the Latin Mass attendee in 2021. And what has sparked this sort of revival in some way of the Latin Mass is in part the hierarchy's unwillingness to be serious about the scandals in the church. Like even somebody like Taylor Marshall, like this whole show is sort of about him. I'm sorry, everybody. But look at what happens to him after the revelations of the McCarrick scandal. That really marks a significant turn, because Uncle Ted was the sort of the great mascot, again, in superficial terms here, but was the great mascot of the bishops, post-council. I mean, he was the ascendant guy. So I think there's a lot of messy, fuzzy thinking that has gone on. And so people are like, oh, well, if Uncle Ted was a dirtbag and a derelict, I want to do anything completely opposite. I'm going to go in the exact opposite. I'm going to attack this way. And so again, it's a tone deafness on the part of people who run
realizing the causes. So take, once again, Taylor Marshall. You look at pre-McCarrick Taylor Marshall, very different guy from post-McCarrick. I think he was red-pilled by McCarrick.
I do too.
I think a lot of traditionalists were red-pilled by McCarrick, and I think a lot of them are going to be red-pilled by the Motu Proprio. And so it's not going to create more unity. It's going to create anger. It's going to create hostility. And especially, and I know we're probably running out of time, but I brought up the issue of families before trying to raise their kids. In many ways, I think this Motu Proprio is tone-deaf and pastorally violent. I'm going to put it that way. Pastorally violent towards families. because the constant refrain I get from so many good and not crazy, good, sound Catholic men and women who are raising children, sometimes large families, right, is that they found no support in their local parish, none whatsoever, for the kind of moral and spiritual environment they wanted their children to be in. Even if they sent their kids to a Catholic school, they were still getting exposed to all kinds of nonsense. So they go to the traditional Latin Mass, make fellowship with like-minded people, run homeschooling co-ops. My ordinariate parish has a homeschooling co-op that my wife teaches. And this is also family-friendly. And why are families, devout Catholic families, desperately trying to avoid the abyss of our culture for their children, and they're not finding answers in standard parishes?
Well, because they know, and those of us with young kids know, that there is no accommodation. It is a lie. It is a myth, and you persist in that delusion at the peril of your own family. And I think people know that. I think people who are trying to be serious about their faith recognize that you can't dance with this culture because this is a culture of death, as John Paul II correctly pointed out.
These are the great victims of this Inapproprio. More so than isolated intellectuals like a Peter Kwasniewski, who is a big TLM guy, or it's people trying to raise families without having their kids having to swim in a cultural septic tank. Okay,
that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. Well, all right. Well, Larry, look, I really want to thank you for popping on here last minute. I know I was a little bit cagey about when we could do this, but I'm trying to fit it in between various things going on with my own kids and my own family. So, but anyway, thank you so much, and I'll get this up as quickly as possible. But until next time, we'll see you again. Take care, brother.
Thank you.
All right, bye.